This is track 2 of lecture 2 of the series Inflation and Price Controls.
There seem to be a variety of good questions. One question is, can you explain what is wrong with the idea that rising demand will raise supply, not prices, up to full employment? Isn't that what happened in the 60s? Well, what I believe is, first let me say I do not believe that this happened in the 60s. What may have happened was that for a time there may have been some reduction in the rate of unemployment as demand was expanded in the 60s. But if we observe what has been happening, demand has been expanded through the increase in the money supply more and more rapidly from the mid-50s on down to the present time. And what has been happening to the unemployment rate? It's been going up at the same time. Now, the reason I believe that expanding demand does not reduce unemployment, does not lead to any additional production, is because the expansion of demand creates a condition in which the unions can ask for higher wage increases without having to cause correspondingly more unemployment. The way I view it, the unions function in their own eyes, their whole reason for existing is to get the highest possible wage increases. The only thing that deters them from asking more and more is the fear that a significant part of their membership will lose their jobs. If demand is expanded, the unions are able to ask for these wage increases without the fear of causing unemployment. Now, that alone, I think, would be a sufficient explanation of why the unions will tend to raise wages just about as fast as demand goes up. Maybe not always exactly as fast, perhaps sometimes not quite as fast, but other times faster. But there are other reasons which positively impel the unions to increase their wage demands as spending rises. One is that the mere effect of more spending is to raise the nominal rate of profit. And as the nominal rate of profit goes up, that is automatically a red flag to the unions. They believe that that is a justification for additional wage demands. And then as soon as they start making the additional wage demands, some prices begin to rise, or some prices start rising simply because there are goods that exist in limited supply, and when demand is expanded, their prices go up. As soon as prices begin to go up, that's double fuel for the unions to ask for additional wage increases. So what occurs is that the unions begin to ask for wage increases pretty much in line with the increase in demand. And I think we can observe this empirically over the last 15 or 20 years, and I think it can be observed in the 1930s. During the 1930s, we had mass unemployment in the United States. The government, from 1933 on, began a major increase in the quantity of money. The volume of spending in the economy increased very greatly, but there was very little headway made against unemployment. The only significant reduction in unemployment that occurred was in the form of government make-work projects, the direct employment of people by the government in the Work Projects Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. There was very little expansion in private employment because wages were going up, wage rates were going up just about as fast as spending. So there was relatively little headway made against the unemployment problem. Now you could ask me, well, why did the unemployment problem disappear in World War II? I will answer that rising demand was not a sufficient explanation. I will simply assert the answer now and prove it, I think, when we get to lecture 8. The reason unemployment was eliminated in World War II was the combination of rising demand coupled with price and wage controls. You see, if wages were controlled, as they were in World War II, and prohibited from rising, then as spending goes up, the unions can't jack up wages. In that context, more demand would result in more employment. but it took price and wage controls to do it. Now, please do not assume that this is a way to eliminate the unemployment problem. Stick around for the rest of the course, and you'd rather have unemployment. All right, so I think that that is what is wrong with the idea that expanding demand will eliminate unemployment. Now, let me say that that idea is extremely powerful, the belief that all we have to do is expand demand and we can eliminate unemployment. The present-day governments all throughout the world believe this, and they are constantly chasing the goal of full employment. It's like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They're always after it with more demand, but it always eludes them because the faster they chase it, the more rapidly prices rise. And there are countries which have truly enormous rates of expansion in the money supply and demand, coupled with fantastic unemployment rates and rising prices. For example, Uruguay, as of a number of years ago, was expanding the quantity of money at a typical Latin American rate, perhaps something on the order of 25% a year. Spending was expanding tremendously. Prices in Uruguay were going up more than 60% a year, and at the same time, unemployment was in excess of 25%, as great as anything we had in the depths of the Depression. That's because the Uruguayan unions were raising wages as fast and perhaps even faster than the Uruguayan government could print money. And just observe, I would go further and say that this policy of expanding demand to eliminate unemployment can actually cause unemployment. Because suppose the unions begin to anticipate that this year, as in the past years, prices and wages will go up 40 or 50%. But now the government is adopting a valiant anti-inflation policy and will only increase the quantity of money 10, 20, or 30%, enough to let demand go up by maybe 30%, let's say, while the unions are raising wages 60%. Well, even if we started with full employment, that could give us 30% unemployment. So you can get mass unemployment as the result of this policy. But I must say, this policy, this idea that you can have full employment by creating money is really deadly. It is perhaps the most powerful factor in favor of inflation in our time. Governments feel free to inflate any time unemployment exists, and this becomes an argument for government spending of any kind. There are people like Lord Keynes who thought that even building pyramids would be a good way to bring about prosperity, because they thought the money spent to build the pyramids would create additional employment and production to some multiple of the value of the pyramids, to a multiple of the cost of the pyramids. Paul Samuelson, Keynes' leading American disciple, argued in an early edition of his textbook that we could have prosperity if the government created money to buy $1 million worth of goods, which we then dumped in the ocean. The argument being that the spending and respending of this million would create additional employment and production. Well, if you can advocate pyramid building, dumping goods in the ocean, it shouldn't be difficult to understand why we have some of the government programs that we do, because bad as they are, they're not as far out as building pyramids. So it's a justification for anything. Now, the question is, does it necessarily follow that with constant demand, as labor unions drive up prices, employers will lay off employees? Could not employers pay their employees the higher wage by reducing their own profits? Is not this argument then the one more often offered by union leaders? How is this argument refuted? All right, the questioner is imagining that wage rates can be increased, the demand for labor can be increased at the expense of profits. This is a fallacy. Let us look at what happens to business sales revenues rather than profits. Business sales revenues are devoted to paying wages and also to buying materials and machinery and whatever other inputs business firms buy. And the rest is paid out in dividends. Part of the dividends are reinvested and used to buy materials, machinery, and pay wages. Now, the profit is already counted. To whatever extent profits are reinvested, profits that are reinvested are already being used to pay wages, buy materials, and machinery. They are not a separate fund available for use a second time. Now, what this means is if we look at what can be done with sales revenues, well, the sales revenues go to paying wages, buying materials and machinery, and some very small portion goes to the personal consumption expenditure of the owners of the businesses. Some part of the dividends that are not saved and reinvested are consumed. All right, so this raises the question, where could higher wage payments come from? They could come from expenditure for materials and machinery, conceivably. But if they could, what would be the effect of that? It would destroy production. Now, how much could there be that they could come from the personal consumption expenditure of the owners? Well, let's try to figure this out. Profits, as I pointed out in the lecture, are generally under 10% of sales, somewhere between 5 and 10%, depending on the industry. Now, roughly half of all profits are reinvested. So roughly half of profits are going into paying wages, buying materials and machinery in the firms that earn those profits. That leaves us with 5% or less, which is paid out as dividends. Of the portion paid out as dividends, some significant chunk is reinvested, which goes to pay for materials, machinery, and labor. So that leaves us with perhaps 2 or 3% that you might imagine as being potentially available for the unions. Well, what part of sales revenues is already wages? Roughly on the order of 50%. So what we're talking about, when you talk about profits as a potential source for higher wages, you might have in mind, at the utmost, assuming you could actually seize these profits, something on the order of a one-shot, non-repeatable increase in wages of perhaps 5 or 6%. So that is not a practical source of increasing wages. And neither is the expenditure for materials and machinery. Now, I should point out the real application of this fact is against the arguments for any kind of redistribution of wealth or income. If redistribution could succeed, the most that it might raise wages on a one-time only, non-repeatable basis would be on the order of 5 or 6%. But then think, what would it do to production? What would be the motive for people to want to produce, the motive of the businessmen? Nothing. This is an argument, I must point out, against any form of socialism. If we adopted socialism, the average person might think that his income will be increased. He might get an increase in income of 6% once, forever. And then the whole economy falls apart. So this is really an argument that leads us against socialism, and I think it shows why profits are not a source of higher wages. Is it possible to define supply unambiguously when either, 1, several goods are present? How does one add pencils and televisions? 2, technological improvements have occurred. How would one compare supply in 1976 to 1936? All right, this is a good question. I do not believe that it is necessary for us in practice to actually come up with a unit of supply so that we can say that supply today is exactly 2.371 times what it was in 1936. All that we have to know is that supply today is very obviously much bigger than it was 100 years ago, and I think we can all agree on that, despite the fact that there is a different mix of goods. Now, how are we adding the different mix of goods? Well, by implication, we're comparing them against some standard of human well-being. We are making a judgment. We're saying that an automobile contributes more to human well-being than does a horse and buggy. And we are adding up the whole range of goods that people have today versus what they had 100 years ago, and we're able to say it's more. and we can say that there are more goods today than 10 years ago by the same standard. I talk about precision in the formula in order to gain clarity of thought. You cannot reason, you cannot think in approximations by saying, well, let's assume there's a big increase in supply or a little increase in supply. You can't divide that and really work with that. So I use concrete numbers. But in statistical practice, to come up with concrete numbers is not necessary, and when you do come up with the concrete numbers, they do not have the precision that they purport to have. There are statistics on just how much supply has increased. You could look it up in the statistics of the Department of Commerce of the United States, and they could tell you that supply last year was 3% or whatever higher than the supply the year before. But that statistic does not have really great accuracy. You could come up with a different one showing 2% or 4%. The point is there is some increase, and in our thinking about it, we want to think in precise terms. In your example, the hypothetical merchant's profit rises to $21, and his taxes rise from $5 to $10. But as soon as the merchant reorders new higher-priced inventory, doesn't his profit drop back to $10, and so his taxes drop back to $5? Couldn't his taxes over a given year be somewhere in a range between $5 and $10? No, his tax burden would be permanently higher so long as the inflation continues. Let's project this into the following year. Suppose we get into the next year, the merchant has bought his goods for $110, and now we assume that inflation is still continuing, raising demand 10% a year. Well, the goods that he sold in the second year for $121, he will now sell for $133.10. So he will have $110 of cost, $133.10 of revenue. His profit will again be 21%. The rate of profit will be permanently raised. The nominal rate is permanently raised so long as the rise in demand proceeds to grow at any given rate. Why is the unemployment rate now higher in the US than most other countries, e.g. England, Italy, Sweden, that have stronger unions and, I think, greater increases in their money supplies? All right, that's a good question. It has got to be that the unions are not driving up the wages quite as fast, or have not done so, quite as fast in relation to the expansion of demand. Now, why haven't they is a question I cannot quite tell you. I know in Germany the unions made it their business not to do anything to disrupt production because they wanted to rebuild Germany as fast as possible. So they even agreed to a 6-day work week. It would have to be, for one reason or another, that the unions have simply chosen not to drive up wages as fast in relation to the rise in demand. But observe, in these countries do have, they do not have full employment. These countries do not have full employment. And prices in those countries are rising rapidly. The unions are driving up prices as fast as demand is currently being expanded. Maybe a little bit faster than it's currently being expanded because unemployment in those countries is growing. Now, you would get mass unemployment in a country like England. In England, the unions are now demanding very large wage increases on the order of maybe 25% a year. Prices in England have been rising very, very sharply. Suppose the British government decided that it really wanted to restrict the rate of inflation. And meanwhile, the unions are out there boosting wages 25%, while the British government will only allow demand to rise 10%. then England is on the precipice of mass unemployment. Either that, or they have to yield to prices and wages continuing to go up at 25%, and maybe next year 50 or 100%. So if they try to stop it, see, one could say, in the United States, the government has been somewhat more restrained in the policy of inflation than these other countries, and so the unions have run into somewhat more resistance here, and therefore there's some greater unemployment. I think that would have to be the answer. Which is the most damaging economically, financing the welfare state by taxes or by inflation? I would say that it is by inflation, because inflation represents the same burden at least, but it strikes in a random way. People, as a result of inflation, may think they're actually growing richer. No one thinks he's growing richer when he's being taxed. But if you look at our example of the merchant, maybe the merchant is not too good an example for this, but I could give you examples and will in a later lecture. It is quite possible for people to believe that as a result of higher profits produced by nothing but inflation, they're better off, when in fact they're not. And then they live as though they're better off. Now I'll give you a simple example which applies to all of you, I think. Because the welfare state is financed by inflation, the nominal rate of profit has risen, and as a result of the rise in the nominal rate of profit, the nominal rate of interest has also risen. The reason that you can get 5% at the Bowery or wherever, and by putting a few dollars a week aside, we'll end up a millionaire at the age of 65, is only because of inflation. Now, if you stop to think, it's not possible that you're going to end up being a millionaire just by depositing a few dollars at the Bowery. If you are a millionaire when you're 65, your $1 million is not going to buy very much. But people believe, they think, well, isn't it great? I'm getting 5%, or look at this, I'm getting 6%. If you think of the rate of interest in connection with the rate at which prices rise, and you subtract the rate at which prices rise from the rate of interest, you do not have any real interest income. For years, anyone who's had money in a savings bank has been suffering a loss. Now, suppose instead of people getting this high nominal interest and thinking that they have a gain, suppose their income were taxed, and then they would realize they had a loss. Well, then they would live differently. They would live in a state, on a basis compatible with their actual condition. But now, people are growing poorer. Year after year, the real value of their savings is shrinking, but they think they have an income, and so they're consuming. If they didn't have that income, they would not consume, they would save. So here's a way that inflation is deadlier than the tax. It paralyzes the proper response. Are there any questions live from the floor? Yes?
It seems to me that the whole argument rests on your first example, which was that demand would be constant, and then the prices would arbitrarily rise. But without discussing, I realize you're going to discuss the velocity of circulation later, but without discussing that at all, I don't see how you can postulate a constant demand. Because the same amount of money, if I keep it or if I spend it, will change what happened with it and how much transactions happen.
All right, you're saying you don't see how I can postulate a constant demand. Well, what I am doing is I'm appraising an argument which says that demand does not matter. Now, if demand did not matter, then we are entitled to assume that it doesn't rise. And then we examine the effects of what happens if it didn't rise. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that in the world, demand is not rising. You see, I think an analogy to what you're asking is, how could a physicist postulate the existence of a vacuum in discussing the law of gravity, when in fact we can't achieve an exact vacuum? Well, does that invalidate the law of gravity? No. Yeah?
What I meant was, what I thought you said in the beginning was, or what I thought you meant was that if the government was not expanding the money supply, and if the banks weren't expanding the money supply by lending out their checking account balances,
Yeah.
then that was the,
Yeah, what I said was that if not for the increase in demand, the activities of the unions could not raise the price level, at least to any significant degree. So their ability to do so rests upon, is only made possible by the fact that the quantity of money is expanded and that spending does go up. So that, I think, is clear. I have a question. Which is safer, Social Security payments or New York City pension payments? Well, I guess in terms of the actual receipt of the money, I mean, whether or not you'll get the dollars, probably the Social Security payments. But if you ask, how safe is Social Security? Not at all. Social Security represents no security at all. What it represents is that everyone is at the mercy of where the government wants to set the Social Security allowances. See, we have inflation. Whatever your Social Security schedule is at the time you start paying in. Like suppose you're 30 years old today, and the top pensioners today are getting $600 a month or whatever. Well, what will $600 be worth when you're 65? Maybe it'll be the price of a loaf of bread. Well, that means here you are, you have to pay in for years, and then what you will get is totally at the whim of the government. Maybe they'll treat you well, maybe they won't. That is no security at all. And the great tragedy is people are led to contribute to this program in the belief that they're providing for their future. If they didn't have this program, people would know that they have to make their own independent provision and they'd save. Well, this program takes away their savings and leaves them with nothing. It's a way of stealing people's savings and provision for the future and placing them totally at the mercy of the government. I would say it is the greatest act of insecurity that was ever perpetrated on a population. A question is, pro-capitalist economists often say that it was only the Second World War that brought us out of the Depression. Since war is anti-production, how can this be? Well, what brought us out of the Depression was not the fact that there was a war. What brought us out of the Depression was the fact that wage rates no longer rose in relation to the demand for labor. The demand for labor was able to get ahead of wages. There was more demand for labor in relation to wages. We would have gotten out of the Depression in 1930 instead of 1941 if instead of having an inflation, having price controls, having a war, having years in which people were getting killed, in which the people in the United States itself had to go without new cars, new houses, new appliances. We could have had full employment from 1930 on if the labor unions and President Hoover had allowed wage rates to fall. That would have ended the Depression. If wage rates had fallen, even though there were some bank failures and a reduced demand in the economy, the reduced demand could have employed all the workers who wanted jobs. So the war was not what brought us out. It was simply more demand in relation to wages, which could have been achieved by lower wages rather than more demand. Mr. Binswanger? Right, that's a very good point. The point being made is, in Social Security, people are turning their savings over to the government, and the government then consumes the savings. either for current spending or to pay the pensions of existing Social Security recipients. If people made independent provision, the savings would be invested, the savings would contribute to more machinery and factories and so forth. So that's a perfectly correct observation. The only alternative that a Social Security advocate could argue is that the government then invest the savings. But that would mean that Social Security would imply socialism, because you'd have the government investing in industry. So Social Security either means government ownership of industry or dissipation of the savings, plus the other points that I made. There's a double question here. What about no gold backing in the IMF? Can there be an inflation bust like in Germany in 1923? Well, I'll answer the second part of the question. Can there be an inflation such as occurred in Germany in 1923, in which the value of money disappeared, in which people were being paid twice a day in order to get their pay before prices rose and wiped it out, in which people would buy 2 beers in a saloon instead of 1 in order to beat the rise in prices on the second? That could happen, and inflation has many built-in forces of acceleration which tend to produce those results. The more rapidly inflation goes, the greater are the forces working in favor of a still more rapid inflation. And you can just think of the fact, look at, first of all, the victims of the existing inflation. They have to turn to the government for help. And how does the government help them? With more inflation. So that makes it go faster. Or look at what happens as soon as prices and wages start rising. If we start out in a condition in which prices are rising very modestly, say 1% a year, and people begin to believe that a 1% rise in prices is normal, and their wages are only rising 1% a year also, and they think, well, prices have gone up 1%, and all that happens to us is at the end of the year we catch up, well, then a point comes where people will want their wages to go up 2%. And when that happens, either some unemployment develops, or the government has to expand the quantity of money a little bit faster. And then prices and wages have started to go up a little bit faster. And you reach a point where prices and wages are now going up perhaps 2%. And then the people who want to be ahead of the game have to ask for an increase of 4%. And this means a little bit more unemployment, or the government has to expand the inflation a little bit more. And then prices start going up 4%, and then they want 8%, and you can see where it leads. Now, the first part of the question, what about no gold backing in the IMF? I assume the question refers to the fact that the IMF plans to sell a third of its gold holdings over the next several years. Well, what about it? I don't understand the question. All right, you're asking in effect, what would happen if the IMF and the various governments, let's say, decided to ditch gold altogether, to unload gold? All right, temporarily, this could be very, very bad for the price of gold. Now let us imagine that all of the governments in the world totally eliminated their holdings of gold, and gold was selling purely as a commodity. Now, even as a commodity, gold is still very valuable because it's extremely rare. Now, many people think that gold is useless, that it's only usable for jewelry and a few uses of that type. In fact, gold is a metal, and it has all of the uses that metals have. The reason it is not put to the uses that most metals are put to is because it's too valuable. If gold were cheap enough, who knows what it might be used for? You could make steel alloys with gold. What are the properties? I don't know. In any case, even if gold were selling purely as a commodity, it would still be quite valuable. It would certainly be more valuable than silver. It's a lot rarer than silver. So let's imagine that gold were selling for as little as $20 or $30 an ounce, strictly as a commodity. But inflation is continuing, and it'll get worse and worse. And so people see that every year prices are going up, and they'll be going up faster and faster. Now, how do you protect yourself against that? You cannot own iron. You'd have to have a big warehouse to store it. You don't want to own wheat. It rots. Real estate is difficult to dispose of. So here is a commodity that is already very valuable. It's very easy to store, very minimal storage costs, and its price is going to rise because the prices of all commodities are rising. So what happens? People looking for inflation hedges start buying gold, not because they want it as a commodity, but to use it as an inflation hedge. So what does that do? That makes gold more valuable than it is strictly on the basis of being a commodity. And then as inflation continues, the value of gold rises from this greater base. And then as people see that gold is more valuable, but it's still rising, more people want it. It becomes even more suited to serve as an inflation hedge. And this kind of thing would restore gold, even if it were purely an ordinary commodity to begin with. It cannot remain an ordinary commodity because it is a commodity especially suited to being saved. And when it becomes saved by a large number of people, that is the precondition to its being used as money. See, just think, suppose a large number of people want to save gold. Now, here you are, you own some gold, and there are things you want to buy. For many years, people have been in the habit, let us say, they own gold, they take their gold to a gold dealer when they need money, they get money, then they take the paper money and they buy something. All right, well, so if gold is being saved by a large number of people, there will be people from whom you are going to buy, the sellers, who will also want to own gold. Now, when the buyers and the sellers identify each other, then instead of you're taking your money to a gold dealer, taking your gold to a dealer, getting paper, taking the paper to the piano dealer, buying a piano, and he takes the paper back to the gold dealer and gets the gold, the condition exists, you give him the gold directly for the piano. And then once people realize that there are a significant number of people willing to take gold in exchange for their goods, then other people become willing to take gold in exchange for their goods, even though they don't want to save gold. They'll take gold because they know they can turn around and spend it with a lot of other people. And then this pretty soon makes gold universally acceptable. It makes it money. So the idea that the government can demonetize gold and simultaneously pursue a policy of inflation is virtually contradictory. The government's policy of inflation is remonetizing gold. There's more interest in gold, more widespread gold ownership in this country than probably at any other time since very early in the century. All the government has to do to assure the remonetization of gold is just to keep on inflate a little faster than it is now, and not stop people from buying gold. And that will remonetize gold. The government, you see, the government did not create gold as money. The market selected gold as money. The government cannot destroy gold as money. This gentleman here.
So everything has gone up at sale rate, except stock market prices, as far as I can see here. What's holding them? What price is stock?
All right, this is a very good question. Why hasn't the stock market risen along with the market in commodities and services and the general level of consumer prices? All I can say in essence, without being able to really prove it in a brief answer, is that one of the major consequences of inflation is to undermine savings and investment in real terms. Now, if you think of our discussion of the effects of inflation in raising the tax burden of our merchant, that is one way that inflation undermines saving and investment. There are many other ways. The stock market depends on the availability of savings and investments. people buy stocks out of savings. Well, inflation retards the growth of savings in relation to consumption. Inflation undermines savings relative to consumption. So the stock market cannot keep pace with the prices of consumer goods. In essence, that is the answer. Yes? All right, what motivation did the government have in legalizing the ownership of gold, since it can lead to the remonetization of gold? Well, some of the congressmen advocated the legalization of gold because they are advocates of the gold standard. The congressman who introduced the bill, Representative Crane, is an advocate of the gold standard. That's why he introduced it. Now, the others, if you ask, well, how did this achieve majority support? I believe it has to be that a sufficient number of the so-called liberals believe their own propaganda that the government can demonetize gold by treating it as not being money. So they boxed themselves into a corner. They kept saying gold is just a commodity, it's a silly superstition. And I think from their perspective, they made a big mistake, which will be fortunate for the country. Any other questions from the floor? Yes?
Several economic books of that take start off by explaining that there's a necessary trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And in response to the argument that you presented, they display something that's called Phillips Curve, which is supposed to be some security bad. Where did that come from, and does that make a difference?
All right. The gentleman says that in many of the economics courses he's taken, they claim that there is a trade-off, a choice, an alternative between rising prices or unemployment. It is claimed that the only way that we can eliminate unemployment is by tolerating a condition of rapidly rising prices. And this relationship, if you diagram it and you put the rate at which prices rise on one axis and the unemployment rate on the other, and it shows that the higher the rate at which prices rise, the lower the rate of unemployment. This has the fancy name of a Phillips Curve after an obscure economist named Phillips. Now, what makes it possible for economists to hold to such a thing is that they do not consider the possibility of unemployment being eliminated through a reduction in money wages. So that is beyond the pale of their thinking. Now, in reality, if we have unemployment and we had a free labor market, that means if the government did not have minimum wage laws, if the unions were not able to resort to violence and intimidation, if employers were not compelled to deal with the unions, then if there's unemployment and the unemployed have to work, they are willing to work for less than the men presently working. And the employers know that, and they tell their present workers that they have to accept reductions. And then the same funds available for paying wages now have the ability, because wages are lower, they can employ more workers. And the larger number of workers employed can produce more goods that have lower costs, and in order to sell these goods, prices have to be lowered. The prices can be lowered profitably because costs have fallen. Well, we would have full employment and a reduction in prices at the same time. The Phillips curve is not an answer to that. The Phillips curve is just a way of asserting, in terms of geometry, the argument that you have to choose between unemployment and rising prices. The whole answer depends on just making them deal with the case of a fall in wage rates being the source of eliminating unemployment. And then we have lower prices. Yes?
Is there any validity at all to the concept doctrine that workers can trust increasing production?
Is there any validity at all to the doctrine that more demand can cause an increase in production. Well, now, if we were talking about more demand for an individual good, like if the demand for shoes rises at the expense of the demand for shirts, then what will happen, as we'll see, is the supply of shoes will be increased, the supply of shirts will be decreased. You have in mind, I'm assuming, can a rise in aggregate demand raise aggregate supply? One can conceive of it happening if, as aggregate demand rises, wages do not rise, or do not rise to the same extent. Then it could happen. But such a thing would not be necessary because you could have full employment achieved through a reduction in wages and prices. And if it is known that demand is going to rise, and you do have powerful labor unions, then it is very, very unlikely, and in our context today, I would say virtually impossible, that more demand would have any significant effect in raising employment, because it would raise wages. As I pointed out, the unions would take it as an opportunity to raise wages. The fact that the nominal rate of profit goes up would spur them on. The fact that many prices would be rising would spur them on. So I think as a practical matter, that can be dismissed. Yes?
How could aggregate demand even conceivably increase without wage increase? Where would the demand come from?
How could aggregate demand increase without wages increasing? Well, the initial source could simply be more money being printed and spent. Now, the advocates of the cost push doctrine, or the people who believe that more demand causes more employment, they would say, well, what will happen very soon is that the extra demand will be translated into extra wages, but they would say that's fine because it would mean extra total payrolls, not higher wage rates. You see, they would say more demand will cause higher wages in the sense of payrolls, and that will enable more people to be employed at the old level of wage rates. So you're using the term, you're saying more demand causes more wages. That's true, but they would argue more demand need not cause higher wage rates.
I
Yes?
understand that the money supply in the United States between 1920 and 1929 rose about 62% or some figure thereabouts. Is that true?
I think the 62% figure, I'm not sure what that refers to. I don't believe that it was that high for the way I've defined the money supply as M1. It was less than that for M1. What you might be referring to is the sum of currency, demand deposits, and time deposits, which is referred to as M2. But the increase in M1 in that period was probably on the order of about 4% a year. Yes?
Does the reduction in taxes necessarily have to mean that there's a greater federal deficit for a given federal budget and more inflation? Is there a trade-off there?
Does a reduction in taxes have to mean a greater deficit and more inflation? Not at all. All you have to do is, when you reduce taxes, reduce government spending.
Well, let's say you couldn't do that, and you still, or you could only do that to some extent, but you wanted to propose a tax cut on corporate profits. And imagine you could get that through. Would there be a trade-off to worry about?
Are you saying, suppose the government reduced taxes, and you say specifically on corporate profits, but it didn't reduce spending. Now, this policy would not have very much of an effect because while it would be true that the corporations would have more profits that they could invest, the government would now have to enter the bond market and borrow more heavily to finance the deficit. Now, if they're not going to print the money, if they're going to borrow savings, then that would mean that as much savings as they're allowing the corporations to keep, they're withdrawing somewhere else in the economy. So there would be no increase in total savings available. What would probably happen in that context is the government would not be borrowing from the citizens. It would be financing part of the deficit by printing money. Yes?
Playing
Yeah.
Didn't that help us out of the depression?
You see that the supply of money fell between 1929 and 1933. That was part of the process of the Depression. See, when a depression originates, it produces a deflation. It actually brings about a decrease in the money supply, and this is one of the factors that makes a depression extra unpleasant. Now, I wouldn't say that the deflation helped us. It was something that would have been much better if we could have avoided it. Yes?
Getting confused about something. What is M1, what is M2, and how do they...
All right, M1 is defined as the sum of currency in circulation plus checking deposits at the commercial banks. M2 is defined as M1 plus the sum of time deposits at the commercial banks. So that is the only difference. But I would not consider the time deposits at the commercial banks to be money. I would say that they are a close substitute for money, but no one is able to take a time deposit and spend the time deposit as such. He first has to cash it. Yes?
Dr. Lichtenberg, there's talk now of changing some bank laws so that a person will be able to use his time deposit, his savings account, against his checking account, so that consumers will be able to automatically take the money out of savings and use it as a personal checking account. You thought about how this might affect the distinction between time accounts and checking accounts?
Well, the question is, there are laws being considered that would enable people to write checks against their savings deposits. Now, I don't know the details of the laws, and there would be different possibilities. But suppose the law was written that all savings deposits, that you could write checks to whatever extent you wanted against savings deposits. Suppose the law, in other words, transformed all of the present savings deposits into checking deposits. If that happened, then I would say that that would represent a tremendous increase in the quantity of money. But I don't believe that that is quite the way that they're doing it. I think I may be mistaken, but what I believe they're trying to do is simply allow the savings banks to have separate checking deposits. You see, you can have a savings account now at a commercial bank and also a checking account. Well, I believe that what they're trying to do is to enable people to have a checking account separate from the savings accounts at the savings banks. Yes? Pardon me? Yeah.
So it'll be in effect like a money order. It's not instantaneous.
You first have to make a withdrawal. That is, if you first have to make a withdrawal, whether it's by going there in person or calling, then it is still not a checking deposit. All right, I think we'll just take about 2 more questions. This gentleman here. Are you saying, aren't we unique in that we do not have interest-bearing checking accounts? I really don't know. I don't know that they have interest-bearing checking accounts everywhere, but I might be mistaken. Yeah. Yeah. You see, all right, well, I think what I mean is, people right now have savings accounts. They cannot presently write checks against those savings accounts. They first have to go and make a withdrawal. If those savings accounts could suddenly be checked on, then the savings accounts would constitute an additional supply of checking deposits. Now, I think that you may be asking the question, Suppose instead of looking at the savings accounts, we look at the present checking deposits, and imagine the banks paid interest on the present checking deposits. Well, that wouldn't make any difference. Pardon me? No. You see, if you have your present checking deposits and the banks started to pay interest, well, they're still checking deposits. It wouldn't matter. One last question. Yes?
If the reserve requirement for savings remains the same, they will not check
Well, yeah, then you'd have not only an increase in the quantity of money from the transformation of the savings deposits into checking deposits, but the point this gentleman is making is that the reserves that the banks hold against the savings deposits is much less than what they hold against the checking deposits, which would mean you could have a vast increase in the amount of deposits relative to reserves. But we're asking like one far-out possibility following another. I don't think it's necessary to go too deeply into that. I think that now we'll have to draw a line. Are you desperate for this question? All right, last one. Yeah.
What do you foresee the rate of inflation in the U.S. in the next several years?
What do I foresee for the rate of inflation in the United States in the next several years? As far as I'm able to see, I think it should go on accelerating. Now, it's conceivable that I could be wrong, but I don't see how, because the great majority of intellectuals in the country believe that inflation is the panacea for most of our problems. So as far as one can determine, I would say that inflation should accelerate. I thank you very much.